what a day it has been. What 3 days it has been so far. Day 3 of the technical sessions, and today witnessed an exciting discussion. What a minute-by-minute account of the discussions today. At early morning today, IFA OECD session on BEPS. You had Robert Stack, the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the US Treasury for International Tax Affairs, and he struck quite a belligerent tone on BEPS and why US would not be a part of the multilateral instrument process. You had OECD's Marlies Deto, who stood her ground on the OECD's various action plans and was quite gung-ho about meeting all the timelines. We have Shefali from BMR, who gave us a little bit more flavor of what was discussed during the 3-hour session in the morning, and then we'll have the one and only Jeffrey Owens, the former tax policy director of OECD, who will share his insights on the 3 days of action and a lot of action that's taken place here at Basel. Shefali?
Thank you, Arun. So today was the day dedicated to BEPS, and a lot of discussion around where do we think we are today, and in the next couple of months we will see pretty much the project coming to an end in terms of all the larger conclusions being drawn out. And it was a session more focused on the stock taking. Do we really think we've achieved the coherence that we set out to achieve? What were the main objectives when G20 and OECD set out on this BEPS plan? And overall, I think all the panelists did a good job in terms of expressing their organization's views or their country positions and justifying why they are where they are. So it was definitely...
Anything particular about the US? Because I think clearly the two people who stood out there, OECD viewpoint, Marley, and then Robert Stack, and I think both of them minced no words, and Robert Stack especially, he surely was not diplomatic. Diplomatic is not what he was.
I wouldn't say that. I think he was being fair. He did appreciate, OECD's work in relation to the transparency and some of the data sharing. I think where he stood ground was more in terms of the US involvement.
Yeah.
And that is also a factor of, what is a mandate with the Congress and what the government can do and cannot do. He did say that the country-by-country reporting is where the US does have an authority.
Yeah.
But US has a strong...
Congress.
Yeah, strong Congress, and also strong preference for the arbitration proceedings. Absolutely. And they are standing right behind that. So hopefully they will be able to, get some breakthrough there and get the other countries to agree on it. But if they are not a part of the multilateral instrument, then it is going to remain a suboptimal solution.
Jeffrey, what do you make of it, Jeffrey?
Well, I think you really stand back. This seminar this morning clearly was the highlight of the week, it's always the best attended. The timing was almost perfect because it's 2 weeks before the Committee on Fiscal Affairs meets, and that's when the decisions will be taken on the reports. It's just under 2 months from the heads of government summit that will be in November. So from that perspective, you couldn't have had a better. Yeah. And I think the organizers have to be congratulated in the sense they chose a lot of the topics that are right at the top of the political agenda. Yeah. What do we hear today? I think, given the constraints that Marlies was under, I think she was very open in describing where the OECD is on these projects. I think the OECD has to be congratulated because they set themselves 15 action points to achieve. They've achieved them all. Yeah. There's a lot of tidying up to do, and I think Marlies and Bob and the other panelists were very open about that. When this gets endorsed by the recommendations get endorsed by the summit, that's not the end of the story. There's a lot more work to be done, and that work will really be on finessing some of the technical aspects in those 15 recommendations, and then biting the bullet on implementation. Yeah, and that to me is the key challenge. Yeah? Are we going to see consistent implementation? How are we going to deal with the disputes that arise? So the less consistent the implementation is, then the more risk of disputes is. One thing that I think is important is this whole issue of certainty. It came up again and again in the discussions that business wants certainty. I very much understand that, but we have to be also realistic. I don't think business has certainty today. Yeah? And if we move just even a little bit forward in terms of getting a greater consensus on what the rules are. And don't forget, the consensus now goes beyond the 34 OECD countries to bring in the BRICS and other participants. That in itself should reduce uncertainty. So I think a lot has been achieved. A lot remains to be done. In some ways, the most difficult part now comes to get this consistent implementation, and that, in a sense, is where the multilateral instrument comes in. Because in my role in Vienna, in fact, we've initiated some work looking at some of the technical issues that would arise with the instrument. Is it feasible? Yes. Is it going to be difficult? Yes. Is it in the interest of business? A resounding yes. Yeah? Because if you've gone through all this pain of trying to get agreement on the BEPS recommendations, and then you're going to have 15 years of uncertainty while the bilateral negotiators go out and negotiate. That's what they call negotiators. And so they'll be trading things off. You give me this BEPS thing, I'll give you that BEPS thing or something else. So the instrument is important in terms of the effectiveness of the implementation of the recommendations, the consistency which will be done, and minimizing disputes. The US position, my take was it was more nuanced. Because you remember what Bob said was, at the moment, we're not there. Yeah?
Yep.
But clearly they'll follow that work, yeah? And when the political situation is right, I'm sure that they'll be joining it, yeah? Particularly as one of the issues that the instrument will be dealing with will be arbitration.
Yep.
The other comment is really coming back to what you're saying, that where was the US on the whole project?
Village stall. I think my question more, Jeffrey, is that there is a feeling which one of your good friends, Philip Baker, expressed in our BEPS newsletter, Shooting Straight Piece, that will we see an international tax conflict or the real possibility of a tax competition if the US is not on board the BEPS Express?
Well, one, we already have tax competition. We already have conflict. Yeah, I mean, this is not going from peace to war. It's going from war to war. Yeah. So that's already there. The US, I mean, I get very annoyed. I mean, there's no question that the US is fully engaged in this project.
Yep.
I mean, way back in '98 when we had the harmful tax practices, they were there. They've led a lot of the BEPS work. They've chaired some of the subgroups there. Yeah, they're at the center of the debate. Yeah, but they're like any other country. They're looking at saying, well, in the context of our own political system, in the context of our economic and tax systems, how can we now move forward? Yeah,
are we overplaying that concern? Maybe
I think that the US is playing the same game as everybody else, but it has certain constraints. The other thing to remember is, of course, that many of the recommendations that are coming out of the BEPS are things that the US has already done on hybrids.
Yeah.
For example. So in a sense, the US is in some ways ahead of the game. Yeah. So I think one has to be very careful of saying that in some way the US is disassociated from this project. I don't think that's the case. They're fully engaged. They have political constraints like any other country. Yeah? And when the heads and when Obama signs up to this, then the US will make a real serious effort to move forward. Yeah? On the country by country, in a sense, you see that you remember the slides that Marley's put up. You had transparency, coherence, and substances. Anything to do with transparency, I think it's not been easy, but it's accomplished this.
Yes.
Whether it's on the exchange of information, whether it's on the rulings and the exchange provisions there, whether it's on the transparency, whether it's on the country-by-country reporting, all that is coming together quite nicely. Yeah? And so there's a lot of consensus there. Coherence, there's progress being made there.
Monitoring.
The monitoring is interesting. I think that's perhaps one area that OECD does need to reflect on. In some ways, if you've spent 2 years getting agreement on what the rules should be, you do then need to think of what procedures could be used to get a consistent implementation. Already they've decided that there'll be some monitoring of the map, but I mean that's after the dispute has arisen. Yeah? I think where you have to have monitoring is, are countries doing what they said they would do? Yeah. And to me, I think the model that we have here is that of the Global Forum on Tax Transparency and Exchange of Information. Yeah, that
Jeffrey,
has a very robust.
I still have this fundamental question, and there were two distinct schools of thought on whether are we really moving the boundary line between source and residence, or are we merely fixing the boundary line? And Marley's clearly felt that it was just a mere fixing of line. We are not moving, so to say.
Well, one, the current boundary line is not clear. That's where we have so many disputes. If you go to China, you go to India, you go to Brazil, they'll have one concept of where the line is. You go to the US, it's another, yeah? So again, we're not moving from an environment where things are perfect, yeah? We're moving from an environment where there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of differences of views, and those differences have been accentuated by the change in the global economy, yeah? Yeah? I mean, just think of a country like China. I mean, China is no longer just a capital importer, it's a capital exporter, yeah? China now has to think not only about how do we tax multinationals when they come into China, but how do we ensure that our tax system doesn't put our multinationals at a competitive disadvantage? Who's the biggest investor in Africa? It's China. Who's one of the biggest investors in Latin America? It's China, yeah? So from that perspective, there's a convergence of interest. But I think it's a mistake to say that if you like, the elephant in the room and the BEPS was source versus residences.
Yes.
And there have been changes. If you change the PE concept, you change that, yeah? Perhaps that's a good thing. My own view is maybe we didn't go far enough. Because I think when some of the BRICS went into the BEPS project, particularly for Action 1, they saw this as an opportunity to have a basic debate about do the current source and residence rules produce the right results, yeah?
Right. So there's still difference of opinion about where the value creation really is, and in the absence of consensus on what are the key value drivers and how do you allocate profits, it is going to remain uncertain. And I take your point that the things are not certain even today. But are we really improving them, or we are just changing the nature of complexity?
No, I think we're clarifying certain of the concepts that we have. The very fact that you now have a group of 44 countries that are sitting down, and talking about these issues the first time, really seriously, This is not, in one group of countries going to the UN and talking, another group of countries going to the OECD. So all of that has meant there's been a real debate. There are unresolved issues, yes? And if you like, formally, the big issues that are linked to source and residence were taken off the table very quickly in the project, But I think, my guess is that there were some non-OECD countries that were not very happy about that. That's a debate we need to have, And I'm not talking about the debate, arm's length versus formally apportionment, because frankly that's a theoretical debate, And I have not yet come across many developing countries that say they would like to go to formally apportionment, It's not in their interest, But I mean, the whole broader debate of, are the sourcing and the residence rules, are they adapted to today's environment? I think the BEPS has began that discussion. It's not finished. It's going to continue, And it's an important discussion to get. And it's important, in fact, to try to get agreement, at least amongst the major economies in the world.
Jeffrey, I think the one area, apart from BEPS, or in some ways a part of BEPS, where we've seen a lot of spirited debate, has been taxpayer rights. You were there yesterday, at times nodding disapprovingly at the way the debate was moving forward. But you did see clearly two viewpoints emerging. One, a viewpoint expounded by Philip Baker, another by Monica Bhatia of the Global Forum. How do you strike that balance between taxpayer rights and the requirement of the tax authorities to get hand on the information, and yet at the same time you want to give some sort of legal wriggle room to the taxpayer, yet you do not want to give him complete immunity? There is no consensus on how do you use stolen data. There seems to be, there's certainly, we don't seem to be quite close to a consensus there.
I think one of the things that probably was not very helpful yesterday is that the discussions were very much coming at it almost primarily from the perspective of the taxpayer and protecting taxpayers' rights, because that was the title of the conference. Yes? But rights always have to be offset against obligations. Yes? And the obligations of the taxpayer is to help the tax administration to effectively implement the system. Yeah? And if there are people that are breaking the rules, not forget, tax evasion is when people break the rules. Yes? Even certain aggressive tax planning may be breaking the rules as well. Yeah? Then you have a right, then to ensure that the tax administration has the information that it needs to implement those rules, to identify those people who are ripping off other taxpayers. Because by ripping off the government, you're ripping off other citizens. Yes? So it's getting that balance is always the challenge for government, the balance between, on the one side, protecting the legitimate rights of taxpayers, and on the other side, making sure that they respect the rules and the tax administration has the information.
But Jeffrey, I mean, if you could give a short answer to this.
I never give a short answer.
I know, but more because are taxpayer rights going to be a casualty of the BEPS process, or do you think in some ways this concern is a legitimate concern?
Of course it's a legitimate.
Or is it a smokescreen?
No, it is a legitimate concern that your taxpayers do have rights. Yeah, and I get very annoyed when people suggest that the OECD has somehow dropped the ball on that. I mean, let's not forget, we've had 2 reports over the last 30 years on taxpayers' rights. The reports always had the title taxpayers'